In 1988, a brutal crime took place in Poland. The majority of people would believe that it belonged as part of a script affiliated with a horror movie, such as Silence of the Lambs or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which were based on the true crimes of Ed Gein from the 1950s, who used human skin to make a corset, leggings, masks, lampshades, waistbins, and upholstered chairs. Macabre, I know. However, on Thursday, the 7th of January, 1999, the captain of a tugboat on the Vistula River felt a sudden movement when manoeuvring his vessel over the water and ordered the crew to check the propeller. When investigating the problem, they expected to find normal debris like branches from trees or maybe a tyre from a car, which was relatively common. On this particular day, the crew were overwhelmed by a disgusting, strong, potent smell coming from what resembled a thick piece of material. But terrifyingly, the substance had a human ear attached to it. Closer inspection of this strange matter created genuine shock and distress, as they guessed it was part of a human body. And they were correct. It was human skin, cut from the torso of a young woman. The men didn't hesitate to notify this gruesome find to the authorities. When the police arrived, they had no doubt that they were dealing with a homicide. Instinctively, a decision was made to send divers into the river to search for any remaining body parts. Precisely a week later, on the 14th of January 1999, the right leg was recovered alongside some garments, but no other remains were ever found. The most important thing at that stage was to identify who the deceased individual was. DNA tests were carried out, which were incidentally amongst the very first genetic tests conducted in Poland. The analysis showed that the victim was a 23-year-old female. She was identified as Katarzyna Zowada, who went missing in November 2 months previously. The 23-year-old was a student at one of the universities in Krakow. Eventually, expert analysis of the injuries revealed that the killer had removed the skin from the victim's torso. This type of criminal behaviour is unprecedented in both Polish and world criminology. Katarzyna's mother actually reported her as missing to the police on the 12th of November 1998. On that date, the young student who suffered with depression was scheduled to meet a mother for an appointment to see a therapist, but failed to turn up. Her mother felt something was wrong, as it wasn't an occasion she would deliberately miss. Her mum was right. Her daughter didn't avoid that appointment intentionally, but instead someone had snatched her from the streets. Perhaps not in the typical way of being kidnapped, because when we look into this, it appears as if she was taken by someone she knew. When the police started to investigate the disappearance, they became aware that she hadn't been attending her university classes for a while. Reports also indicated she didn't have many friends, as she preferred her own company. However, the few friends she did have noticed a recent change in Katarzyna's behaviour. Instead of appearing depressed or sad, which was her normal, she became much more optimistic about life, as she lost quite a bit of weight and even made an appointment to have her hair dyed blonde. These recent changes in her appearance convinced a number of people to assume that she was romantically involved with someone. There was a belief that a man she met persuaded her to accompany him to a house on the outskirts of Krakow. That man was named Robert J. Interestingly, he was questioned by the police, as he was on their radar in connection with her disappearance, but wasn't arrested at the time, and the case went cold in 2000. And it remained cold for well over a decade. Then in 2012, the prosecutor's office decided to reopen the file, taking advantage of the latest developments in forensic science. Detectives were assembled to re-examine the evidence, including an order to exhume her remains for additional forensic examination. A 3D model of the injuries inflicted on Katarzyna was also created, and their research indicated that the perpetrator had used a sharp tool to wound her in the neck, armpit and groin. This not only induced great pain, but would have caused her to bleed to death. Then in 2014, using data gained from their new findings, an FBI representative for Europe generated a psychological profile of the suspect, indicating the sadistic nature of his tendencies. 2 years later, investigators consulted a specialist in forensics, an expert in the field of signs and torture on the human body, who deduced that Katarzyna had been tortured extensively before her death. He further ascertained that the killer was likely trained in martial arts. The findings strongly highlighted that the victim experienced perhaps one of the worst deaths imposed on a human. It goes without saying that humans can be extremely cruel to each other. How often do we hear about people being stabbed, being shot or strangled? This happens on a daily basis. Although there are many other ways that individuals are killed, it's exceptionally rare to hear of deaths where someone is skinned alive. It seems that the killer of this young woman took her to a secluded place or perhaps a room hidden away from society. He then tied Katarzyna up so that there was no possibility of escape. She would have been terrified. Who knows? He may have even explained to her what he was about to do. What he was about to do was remove her skin. Apparently while she was still alive, according to the experts. The same skin that was shockingly discovered in January of 1999 on the propeller of that tugboat. In my mind, this would be one of the worst ways a human could possibly die, because the skin is the body's largest organ, which regulates our temperature. Without skin, our body heat would drop dramatically, essentially bringing on severe dehydration due to a lack of moisture needed for efficient cell functioning. In addition, millions of exposed capillaries will continuously bleed, leading to massive blood and fluid loss. On top of that, countless numbers of exposed nerve endings would automatically send a continuous supply of excruciating pain signals to the brain. Katarzyna could have lived for several hours, or perhaps even for a few days, after her skin was removed. Although she went missing in November of 1998, her partial remains didn't turn up until January of 1999. Meaning her dreadful ordeal took place sometime in between those dates. If shock or blood loss didn't kill her, it would only be a matter of time before airborne bacteria did the job. Perhaps during this period, the perpetrator was sitting in the corner of the room, watching his victim slowly die. I'm sure, like me, it makes you question who would have been capable of inflicting this type of punishment on the 23-year-old. The specialist in forensics who looked at the case was convinced it was someone who took delight in torture. Yet, it appears based on the evidence that the killer's goal was to make a suit out of her skin. The guy who did this was still at large. If we move forward a few years to 2017, bearing in mind the authorities were still digging for clues and had performed a number of searches in the Vistula River, looking for any other evidence in an attempt to solve the case, what they discovered ended up above ground, as they were led to a man who had already been a person of interest shortly after the murder. Remember the chap named Robert J., who many people suspected Katarzyna was secretly seeing romantically? Well, he lived just a few hundred meters away from where her skin was found. The police arrested him on suspicion of her murder, due to evidence they had against him. During their investigation, they learned that he was into torturing animals. And additionally, he was an eccentric, often indulging himself in wearing women's clothing, yet he had a problem with women and was known to harass them. Those who knew him well said that he had a thing for blonde women, and one of his female neighbours, who was a blonde, was terrorised by him. When Katarzyna started to make changes regarding her appearance, one of the things that she did was dye her hair blonde. I wonder if he was behind that. His background regarding work is of interest, as he spent time working in a morgue while in the military. And at one point he also worked for the Krakow Institute of Zoology, where he would have picked up knowledge about skinning animals. However, he was fired from the institute for killing all of their rabbits. And after the police arrested him regarding Katarzyna's case, he always denied murdering her, even claiming he didn't know who she was. Yet there was video surveillance of him visiting her grave. To add to the suspicion, he allegedly wrote about the murder in a journal. In addition to this, one of his friends contacted the police and in a written statement identified Robert J. as the killer. And since then, the authorities have accumulated an 800-page dossier detailing their findings against him. They've accused him of murdering Katarzyna with particular cruelty, and it includes, as the FBI profiler mentioned, that he was a cruel, sadistic person. The 3D image pertaining to the injuries sustained by Katarzyna, including her right leg that was recovered from the river, were also examined, producing supplementary information regarding cuts, lacerations, broken bones, and various marks suggesting she was chained or tied up, while possibly being skinned alive. Fortunately, their main suspect has been in custody since 2017, where he's been assigned the status of a dangerous prisoner. Unofficially, it's been said that in their quest for evidence, the police searched his home in 2017, where they discovered blood alongside 2 hair fibres that they believe belonged to the victim. However, the prosecutor's office neither confirms nor denies this information. It's a mysterious case that's not been fully solved. Although they had Robert J. in custody, eventually convicting him for the murder, a dramatic twist in the case took place in October 2024. The Krakow Court of Appeal overturned the conviction, applying a principle dating back to Roman times, known as dubio pro reo, meaning that judges and juries should refrain from convicting someone if they have any doubt. In other words, they need to prove guilt by reasonable doubt. The appeal court looks at all of the evidence the police had built up against their suspect, a suspect who continually proclaimed his innocence, and it was determined that the evidence was circumstantial, lacking the sufficient proof to justify his involvement. As a consequence, they acquitted Robert J. after 7 years of detention. According to my understanding, no retrial has ever been ordered. But the National Prosecutor's Office pursued a separate investigation into Katarzyna's murder in late 2024. Their investigation was unrelated to Robert J., who is currently seeking compensation for what he says was wrongful imprisonment. It's interesting how, after 28 years, this unsolved case is still receiving plenty of extensive coverage through the Polish media. In addition to that, it appears that the police don't have any other suspects. The question regarding who killed the 23-year-old and why her body was treated in such an inhumane manner officially remains unanswered. However, my hope is this, that the investigation team will eventually gather up all the necessary information required in order to put the person who committed the murder away for as long as Polish law permits.